Anthropic handed a model an engineering drawing of a machine part, asked it to rebuild that part as a 3D model in code, and then deliberately gave it no way to actually look at the drawing. So it wrote its own computer vision pipeline, pulled the geometry out of the raw pixels, and rebuilt the part. Anthropic says no competing model in the same setup solved that task in 5 attempts. Welcome to AI Daily. This is a deep dive on Claude Opus 5, which shipped on Friday, July 24th. And we are not here to review it. We are here to take apart what it actually changed, the architecture of the request, the price of frontier work, and the scaffolding that labs are now deleting. Start with what actually shipped. On July 24th, Anthropic released Claude Opus 5, model ID Claude-Opus-5. It went live the same day across Claude.ai, Claude Code, Claude Cowork, the Claude API, Amazon Bedrock, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Foundry. It became the default model on Claude Max. The announcement thread on Hacker News collected roughly 1,760 points and over 1,300 comments, which puts it among the largest AI launch threads of the year. Opus 4.8 stayed available everywhere alongside it. Now the strange part, and it is the key to this whole story. Anthropic's own system card says Opus 5 is not more capable overall than Claude Fable 5, its most capable general access model. But the launch post then lists Opus 5 ahead of Fable 5 on most of the benchmarks it shows. Developers on Hacker News noticed immediately and asked, repeatedly, what the point of two nearly identical models is. The honest answer is that this is a segmentation decision, not a capability one. Hold that thought, because it explains the pricing. 2 days later came the reality check. On July 26th, Anthropic's status page opened an incident titled Elevated Errors for Opus 5. It hit Claude.ai, the console, the API, Claude Code, and Claude Cowork at the same time. Investigations started at 0917 UTC. The cause was identified at 0945. A fix went in at 1028, and it was resolved at 1044. Roughly 1 hour and 27 minutes. Anthropic did not publish a root cause. Separately, developers on Hacker News were already complaining about dropped sessions and errors on paid tiers before the launch. Back to that machine part. The reason Anthropic leads with it is that it is not a benchmark score, it is a behavior. The model was blocked from seeing the image, so instead of failing or guessing, it built the missing capability itself, then used it. In Anthropic's framing, Opus 5 verifies its own work without being told to, and delegates to subagents more readily. That last part has a cost. Anthropic's own documentation now tells developers to delete instructions like include a final verification step, because on Opus 5 they cause over-verification. Under the hood, the request itself changed shape. Opus 5 has a 1 million token context window, and here is the detail people miss. 1 million is both the default and the maximum. There is no smaller variant. Max output is 128,000 tokens. Thinking is now on by default rather than opt-in. The effort ladder runs low, medium, high, extra high, and max, with high as the default. And there is a hard-breaking change. Setting thinking to disabled while effort is extra high or max returns a 400 error. Then there is the change with the widest blast radius, and it has nothing to do with weights. In a companion post, Anthropic states that it removed over 80% of Claude Code's system prompt for Claude 5 generation models, with no measurable loss on its coding evaluations. Read that again. The prompt engineering that a team hand-tuned for older models was actively hurting the newer ones. Anthropic lists 6 shifts. Rules become judgment. Examples become interface design. Upfront context becomes progressive disclosure. Repetition becomes conciseness. Manual memory files become automatic memory, and flat specs become rich references like test suites and rubrics. On safety, the numbers are unusually specific. Anthropic's automated behavioral audit scores Opus 5 at 2.30 on its misaligned behavior scale, the lowest of any recent Claude model. Prompt injection attack success rates fell from 5.5% to 2% at 15 attempts, and in computer use environments from around 7% to around 0.5%. Safety classifier trigger rates on Frontier Bench dropped from 42% to 5%. One policy change matters for security teams. Opus 5 now permits source code vulnerability discovery at all access levels, while still blocking it in compiled binaries. Here are Anthropic's own headline claims, all from the launch post. On Frontier Bench version 0.1, Opus 5 more than doubles Opus 4.8 and takes the top spot. On CursorBench 3.2, it lands within 0.5% of Fable 5's peak, at half the cost per task. On ARC-AGI 3, which tests novel problem-solving, it scores about 3 times the next best model. On Zapier's AutomationBench, it hits roughly 1.5 times the next best pass rate at the same cost per task. On OSWorld 2.0, it exceeds Fable 5 at 1/3 the cost. And in life sciences, the biggest jump is over 10 percentage points on organic chemistry. Now the independent read from Artificial Analysis, which runs its own harness. It puts Opus 5 first on its intelligence index with a score of 61. But the same page shows the trade. Output speed is 52.6 tokens per second, against a median of 76 for reasoning models in the same price tier. Time to first token is measured at 68 seconds. Blended price works out to $3.85 per million tokens. Translated, this is the smartest model on that index, and you are paying for it in latency, not just in dollars. For business coordinates, Anthropic reported roughly a $47 billion annualized revenue run rate as of May, up from about $9 billion at the end of 2025, and its Series H in May valued the company near $965 billion. That is the balance sheet a 1-hour outage lands on. For market backdrop only, and with no causal link to this launch, over the last 6 sessions, Alphabet closed down about 7.8%, Amazon down about 6.1%, Microsoft down about 3.1%, while Nvidia was up about 2% and AMD up about 5.3%. Facts only, no investment advice here. Put it on the board. On the Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index, Opus 5 sits at 61. Anthropic's own Fable 5 is at 60. OpenAI's GPT 5.6 Sol is at 59. Kimi K3 is at 57. Opus 4.8 is at 56. Grok 4.5 is at 54. That is a 6-point spread across 6 labs at the top of the frontier. The gap between first and fifth is now smaller than the gap between most models and their own previous generation. Leads at the frontier are measured in weeks, not product cycles. Intelligence is not the only axis, and on the other axis, Opus 5 looks very different. On published cost per task figures, GPT 5.6 Luna comes in around 21 cents, Grok 4.5 around 31 cents, Kimi K3 around 94 cents, GPT 5.6 Sol around $1.04, and Fable 5 around $2.75. One widely upvoted Hacker News comment summarized the position bluntly. Opus 5 is roughly 10% smarter than Grok 4.5 for about 10 times the cost. Half of Fable's price is still not cheap in absolute terms. And look at the release calendar. Artificial Analysis noted 4 frontier launches in 8 days earlier this month, with 6 labs now fielding a model above 50 on its index. Grok 4.5 landed July 8th. GPT 5.6 went generally available July 9th. Muse Spark 1.1 and Kimi K3 followed. Opus 5 arrived on the 24th. A recurring observation on Hacker News is that this is exactly why model routing has become one of the fastest growing layers in the stack. When 10 labs ship dozens of variants with different thinking levels and price tiers, choosing correctly becomes the product. Here is the detail that got almost no coverage, and it may be the most commercially important one. Anthropic's own documentation states that, consistent with prior Opus models, Opus 5 does not have data retention requirements for general access. Fable 5 does carry a 30-day retention requirement. A developer on Hacker News pointed out that this is why Fable has no ARC-AGI score on the comparison chart at all, since the benchmark could not run under that policy. So the real product story is not benchmarks. It is that enterprises can now get near flagship capability without the retention clause that blocked procurement. Practitioners are not uniformly impressed, and that matters too. Reviewers at Every and at Lenny's newsletter both landed on brilliant but frustrating. Anthropic's own docs warn that default responses and written deliverables now run longer. One developer wrote that Opus 5 flagged 4 bugs in a large C++ review, and on recheck, all 4 were false. Others complained about persistent stylistic tics that Fable had shed. One product leader said she disliked working with it, and then ranked it first in her own blind test. That gap between how a model feels and how it scores is now the central problem in evaluating these things. But step back from the review cycle, and the structural shift is clear. If a lab can delete 80% of the scaffolding around its flagship coding product and lose nothing measurable, then a large amount of accumulated prompt engineering across the industry is now dead weight. Value moves from writing instructions to designing interfaces, from stuffing context upfront to loading it on demand, from hand-maintained memory files to automatic memory. Anthropic is shipping a Claude Doctor command specifically to help teams find what to cut. The uncomfortable implication is that your carefully tuned prompt library may be your bottleneck. Three things to watch. First, capacity. An 87-minute error incident 2 days after launch, on top of pre-existing complaints about dropped sessions, is a demand signal as much as an engineering one. Also watch fast mode. It runs about 2.5 times faster at $10 per million input and 50 per million output, but it is currently a research preview on the Claude API only. It is not on Bedrock, Google Cloud, or Microsoft Foundry. When and whether that changes tells you how much spare capacity actually exists. Second, watch the price curve rather than the leaderboard. The interesting number in this launch is not 61 on an index. It is that per token pricing stayed identical to Opus 4.8 at $5 and $25, while the capability underneath it roughly doubled on Anthropic's own coding benchmark. That is deflation delivered through capability, not through a price cut. If rivals answer the same way, the cost of a completed task keeps falling even as sticker prices hold. Given a cadence of 4 frontier launches in 8 days, we should know within weeks. Third, watch the model line itself. Anthropic now fields Opus, Sonnet, Haiku, Fable, and Mythos, and developers openly say they cannot tell what the names mean anymore. Opus 5 and Fable 5 share safeguards with exactly one difference. That's source code vulnerability exemption. On offensive cyber tasks, Opus 5 sits behind Mythos 5, and the system card notes it cannot chain complex exploits the way Mythos can. Whether that source code exemption gets extended upward, and whether the retention policies converge, will tell you more about Anthropic's enterprise strategy than any benchmark chart. So here is the summary. A model that builds the tools it was denied. A 1 million token window that is no longer optional. A lab deleting 4/5 of its own scaffolding and losing nothing. A 6-point spread across 6 frontier labs. And an 87-minute outage 2 days in, sitting on a $47 billion run rate. The benchmark number will be beaten within weeks. The structural changes underneath it will not be. That was our deep dive on Claude Opus 5. Every figure here comes from Anthropic's own posts, its documentation, its status page, independent measurement, and developer discussion. If you want the frontier explained instead of hyped, subscribe to AI Daily. We will be back tomorrow.